Imagine a conflict so brief that you could watch it twice during a single lunch break, yet so decisive it permanently altered the fate of an entire nation. In the time it takes for a modern commute, an empire was challenged, a palace was leveled, and a sovereign's dreams were reduced to ash. This is the story of the 38 minutes that proved just how ruthlessly the clock of history can tick when diplomacy fails. The fragile inheritance. History usually measures its greatest upheavals in years, decades, or even centuries. Yet the fate of Zanzibar was decided in a span of time so brief it barely qualifies as a footnote in a soldier's diary. To understand how we reached those frantic 38 minutes, we have to look at the island not as a tropical paradise, but as a high-stakes chessboard. By the late 19th century, Zanzibar was the crown jewel of East African trader hub of spices, ivory, and, more darkly, the final flickering embers of the Indian Ocean slave trade. It was a place where local power was increasingly becoming a polite fiction maintained by British oversight. The balance of this world rested on a delicate agreement between the Sultanate and the British Empire, a partnership that functioned only as long as the man on the throne was willing to listen. Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini was that man. He reigned with a quiet compliance, keeping the peace while the British Consul General, Basil Cave, watched from the sidelines. But have you ever wondered how quickly a stable alliance can evaporate when the person holding it together simply stops breathing? On August 25, 1896, Sultan Hamad died suddenly in his palace. The cause was whispered to be poison, and the prime suspect was already marching toward the throne room. Khalid bin Barghash, the Sultan's nephew, didn't wait for a British blessing or a formal mourning period. Within hours of his uncle's death, he had occupied the palace, surrounded himself with nearly 3,000 loyalists, and declared himself the new ruler. To the British, this wasn't just a local succession, it was a brazen act of defiance against the very concept of imperial order. Khalid represented a faction that wanted Zanzibar for the Zanzibaris, a direct threat to the treaties that gave Britain its grip on the region. Imagine the tension in the humid coastal air as the British consul looked out at the palace and saw the Sultan's red flag being hoisted without his permission. Khalid was young, headstrong, and seemingly convinced that the British were bluffing. He turned the palace into a fortress, dragging old bronze cannons to the shore and lining the windows with riflemen. He was betting his life and his kingdom on the idea that the British would not dare open fire on a city centre. But he failed to realize that for an empire at its zenith, the only thing more valuable than a colony was the terrifying reputation required to keep it. The stage was set, the players were locked in, and the countdown to 9 a.m. had begun. If you were standing on those docks, watching the British warships slowly swivel their massive guns toward the shore, would you have stayed to fight for a crown, or would you have seen the shadow of an ending that no amount of bravery could stop? The ultimatum in the harbor. As the sun rose over the Indian Ocean on August 26th, the residents of Zanzibar town awoke to a sight that signaled the end of an era. Stretched across the harbor like steel predators were 5 of the Royal Navy's finest, the cruisers Philomel, Phoebe, and St. George, accompanied by the gunboats Sparrow and Thrush. Their cannons weren't just pointed at the palace. They were calibrated with the cold, mathematical precision of a Victorian firing squad. Basil Cave, the British representative, wasn't interested in a long-winded diplomatic dance. He issued a final, chillingly simple ultimatum: lower your flag and vacate the palace by 9 a.m. tomorrow, or we open fire. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of religious fervor and desperate bravado. Khalid bin Barghash had gathered a force of roughly 2,800 men, a patchwork of palace guards, loyal servants, and local civilians who believed that their numbers and their faith could withstand the British onslaught. They had positioned a 17th-century brass cannon and a few Maxim machine guns, gifts from previous European visitors, on the palace terraces. But can a few pieces of ornamental artillery truly stand against the most advanced naval force on the planet? Khalid seemed to think so. He sent a message back to Cave stating, "We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us." It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Behind the scenes, Cave had already secured the green light from London. The telegram from the Foreign Office was brief: "You are authorized to adopt whatever measures you may consider necessary." This wasn't just about who sat on a throne. It was about the sanctity of the British word. If Khalid were allowed to seize power through a coup, every other protectorate in the British Empire would take note. The British weren't just protecting a spice trade, they were protecting the myth of their own invincibility. As the minutes ticked toward the 9 a.m. deadline, the harbor became a theater of the macabre. Hundreds of European residents were evacuated to the safety of the ships, while thousands of Zanzibaris crowded the shore, some curious, others terrified, watching the British sailors clear the decks for action. On the Thrush, the gunners held their lanyards, their eyes fixed on the palace clock. Have you ever considered the weight of those final minutes? The silence in the harbor must have been deafening, broken only by the lapping of the waves against the hulls of the warships. Khalid remained inside, perhaps waiting for a miracle, perhaps waiting for the British to blink. But as the clock hand touched the 12, the silence didn't break, it shattered. The 38-minute storm, at precisely 9 a.m., the order was given. On the HMS Thrush, the first 6-pounder barked, sending a shell screaming across the water and into the palace walls. It was the opening note of a symphony of destruction. If you have ever wondered what the disparity between an industrial superpower and a regional kingdom looks like, this was the moment. The British were not engaging in a tactical skirmish. They were performing a demolition. The palace, built largely of wood and fragile coral stone, was never designed to withstand high-explosive naval shells. Within the first 2 minutes, the Sultan's artillery on the shore was reduced to scrap metal, and the defenders' Maxim guns were silenced before they could even find their range. The air in the city thick with the smell of cordite and pulverized stone. Inside the palace, the scene was one of pure, unadulterated chaos. The 2,800 defenders, many of whom had been chanting songs of defiance just minutes earlier, now found themselves trapped in a crumbling death trap. There was nowhere to hide. The shells from the cruisers didn't just hit the palace, they punched through the walls and exploded deep inside the living quarters, turning the ornate furniture and silken tapestries into fuel for a growing inferno. Does courage even matter when the enemy is a mile away, invisible behind a curtain of smoke, raining down fire you cannot return? While the palace burned, the Zanzibari navy, which consisted of a single outdated wooden yacht named the HHS Glasgow, attempted a final, suicidal gesture of defiance. The Glasgow opened fire on the HMS St. George with its own small-caliber guns. It was like a gnat attacking a lion. The British cruiser didn't even need to maneuver. It simply swiveled its heavy guns and riddled the Glasgow until it began to settle into the harbour silt. The British sailors, in a display of Victorian chivalry that sat awkwardly alongside the carnage they were inflicting, actually lowered lifeboats to rescue the drowning Zanzibari crew as their ship went down. By 9:35 a.m., the palace was a skeletal ruin, and the Sultan's flag, which Khalid had refused to lower, was finally shied away by a British shell. The fire from the ship slowed, then stopped. As the smoke cleared, the magnitude of the lopsidedness became clear. In roughly half an hour, over 500 of Khalid's men were dead or wounded. The British casualties, one petty officer on the Thrush, who was injured but would later recover. The war was over before the British officers had even finished their morning tea. But as the echoes of the cannons faded, a new question emerged. Where was the Sultan? And what would become of the people who were left to sift through the ash? The smoking palace. As the final shell whistled through the humid air and the thunder of the HMS St. George fell silent, a haunting stillness descended over the Zanzibar waterfront. The time was 9:40 a.m. In the span of a single lesson in a schoolroom, a kingdom had been dismantled. The palace, once the proud symbol of the Omani-Zanzibari elite, was now a jagged, blackened skeleton of timber and stone, hemorrhaging thick plumes of oily smoke into the sky. But as the British landing parties began to row toward the shore, they found a city in a state of surreal transition. The war was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Where was the man who had started it all? Khalid bin Barghash, who had stood so defiantly just an hour prior, was nowhere to be found among the ruins. As the first shells had begun to tear the palace apart, realizing the utter futility of his position, the Sultan had slipped out a back entrance. Under the cover of the chaos and the blinding smoke, he and a small group of loyalists fled to the German consulate. This created a new, delicate diplomatic crisis. The British had won the battle, but their primary antagonist had claimed sanctuary under a rival European flag. Have you ever considered how a 38-minute war could have accidentally sparked a much larger global conflict between the great powers? On the palace grounds, the scene was one of grim devastation. Over 500 Zanzibari defenders lay dead or dying among the rubble. The survivors, dazed and covered in ash, wandered the streets or attempted to douse the fires that threatened to consume the entire commercial district. The British Marines who moved in to secure the area weren't met with a counterattack. but with the hollow stares of a population that had just witnessed the absolute limits of their own power. The fortress had been revealed as a paper tiger, and the psychological impact of such a swift, mechanical slaughter was perhaps more damaging than the explosives themselves. The British immediately set to work, not with bandages, but with a new administration. Even as the embers were being kicked aside, they were already searching for their hand-picked successor, Hamad bin Muhammad. They needed the smoke to clear quickly so the world could see the new order. The palace was still burning, and the dead were still being counted. Yet the machinery of empire was already demanding a return to business as usual. Does a victory this lopsided bring true stability? Or does it simply bury the seeds of resentment so deep that they stay hidden for generations? As the British flag rose over the ruins, the message was clear. Zanzibar was no longer a partner. It was a subject. The architecture of submission. With the palace still smoldering, the British didn't waste a single hour on sentimentality. While the fires were being extinguished, the political landscape of Zanzibar was being physically reconstructed. By the afternoon of that same day, barely hours after the bombardment ended, the British had already installed their chosen successor, Hamad bin Muhammad, as the new Sultan. This was not a coronation of a sovereign. It was the appointment of a manager. The message to the local population was unmistakable. The Sultan's authority now flowed directly from the British consulate, not from tradition, and certainly not from the will of the people. But the architecture of submission went deeper than just choosing a new face for the throne. The British demanded that the Zanzibari government pay for the very shells that had destroyed the palace. This was a common imperial tactic: indemnity. They were forced to cover the costs of the British coal, the ammunition used, and even the service of the Royal Navy in crushing their own rebellion. Imagine the psychological weight of that, having to pay for the destruction of your own capital. Doesn't it make you wonder how an empire maintains its grip, not just through fire, but through the cold, calculated use of debt and bureaucracy? The Sultan's palace was never rebuilt in its original, sprawling form. Instead, the area was cleared, and the British began to reorganize the waterfront to better suit their administrative needs. The Sultan was moved to a smaller, less imposing residence, literally and figuratively shrinking his stature in the eyes of his subjects. The British also used this moment of absolute dominance to finally force through a change they had been pushing for years: the total abolition of slavery on the island. While a noble cause on the surface, its implementation in 1897 was a final, crushing blow to the economic power of the old Arab elite who had supported Khalid. In this new era, the British resident became the true power behind the curtain. The Sultan became a ceremonial figurehead, appearing at parades and signing decrees he had no part in writing. This 38-minute war had effectively ended Zanzibar's status as a semi-independent state and turned it into a textbook protectorate. The clockwork conquest had worked perfectly. It proved that in the age of steam and steel, the distance between a defiant kingdom and a compliant colony was less than an hour of naval gunfire. But when a nation is built on the ruins of a bombardment, can it ever truly find its own voice again, or is it destined to remain an echo of its conqueror? The echoes of a short war. The dust eventually settled over the ruins of Zanzibar, but the shockwaves of those 38 minutes traveled far beyond the shores of East Africa. In the corridors of power in London, Berlin, and Paris, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was hailed as a masterpiece of colonial efficiency. It became the ultimate cautionary tale, a grim blueprint for how the civilized world dealt with perceived insolence. But have you ever paused to think about what this meant for the rest of the continent? This wasn't just a localized conflict. It was a loud, violent broadcast to every king, chief, and sultan from the Nile to the Zambezi. Resistance is not just futile. It is instantaneous suicide. For the people of Zanzibar, the silence that followed the war was heavy. The island had been a cosmopolitan hub for centuries, a place of deep history and complex social hierarchies. In less than an hour, that history was partitioned into before and after the bombardment. The British victory effectively froze the social evolution of the island, cementing a pro-British elite in power, while disenfranchising those who had sought a path independent of European influence. It raises a chilling question: how much of a nation's spirit is lost when its leaders are taught that their only survival strategy is total, unquestioning transparency to a foreign power? Meanwhile, the man who started the clock, Khalid bin Barghash, became a ghost in his own land. Safely ensconced within the German consulate, he became a pawn in the burgeoning rivalry between Great Britain and Imperial Germany. The British demanded his surrender. The Germans refused, eventually smuggling him off the island in a rowboat to German East Africa. Khalid lived the rest of his life as a shade of a king without a kingdom, a reminder of a 38-minute dream that ended in a nightmare. His presence in the region remained a thorn in the side of the British for decades, proving that while you can destroy a palace in minutes, displacing the idea of sovereignty takes much longer. The 38-minute war also changed the nature of warfare itself, or at least how it was perceived by the public. It contributed to the myth of the splendid little war, where technology ensured low casualties for the victor and decisive results. It reinforced a dangerous overconfidence in the West, a belief that industrial superiority was a substitute for diplomacy. As the 19th century drew to a close, the memory of Zanzibar's smoking palace served as a grim reassurance to empires that they could manage the world by the clock. But as we look back, we have to ask, was the peace bought that morning a true peace? Or was it merely the silence of a house whose foundation had been blown away?
The price of a clockwork conquest. When we look back at the Anglo-Zanzibar War, it is easy to get lost in the triviard, the 38-minute record that has made it a favorite for pub quizzes and history buffs alike. But if we peel back the layers of that brief, violent morning, we find a story that is far more haunting than a mere statistic. This was the moment the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a final brutal demonstration of gunboat diplomacy, where the sheer mechanical force of an empire could override the soul of a nation in less time than a lunch break. What is the true cost of a victory that requires no struggle? For the British, the price was a slow erosion of their moral standing. While they claimed the war was about legal succession and ending slavery, the world saw a superpower pulverize a defenseless city to make a point. It set a precedent that power didn't need to be negotiated. It only needed to be displayed. For the people of Zanzibar, the price was even higher. They didn't just lose a palace. They lost the ability to determine their own future. The shadow of those 5 warships loomed over the island for nearly 70 years. Until the revolution of 1964 finally swept away the remnants of the protectorate the British had so violently installed. Think about the sheer disparity of that morning. 1 injured sailor on one side and 500 lives extinguished on the other. Does such a gap in loss allow for any real reconciliation? The Anglo-Zanzibar War teaches us that a short war is often a long-term scar. It reminds us that when technology and ego collide with tradition and desperation, the result isn't just a change in leadership-s, a shattering of a culture-s sense of safety. The smoke has long since cleared from the Zanzibar waterfront, and the House of Wonders has been restored. But the echoes of those 9:02 a.m. cannons still whisper a warning to the modern world. History is full of long, grueling campaigns, but perhaps the most revealing moments are the ones that happen in the blink of an eye. The 38-minute war stands as a testament to the terrifying efficiency of the colonial machine and the fragile nature of sovereignty when faced with the barrel of a gun. As you walk the winding, narrow streets of Stonetown today, it's hard not to look at the clock and wonder, if everything you knew could be dismantled in half an hour, what would you spend your last 38 minutes defending? The palace fell, the Sultan fled, and the empire moved on, but history never forgets the day the clock stopped for Zanzibar.